All right, Chris Knight of Knight Barbell Club, talking about deadlifts today. So what I want to do is kind of cover the basics of conventional deadlifting, sumo deadlifting, kind of what you as an athlete are looking for when it comes to performance, maybe muscles involved, and how to get as much pounds on the bar as possible if you're competitive. So let's break it down. Conventional, in very simple terms, is deadlifting with your feet inside of your hands, hands outside of your feet, finding a nice narrow, sometimes within shoulder width position with your feet, driving knees forward into the bar, coming up all the way through full extension with straight legs, completed deadlift. Sumo is the opposite, and we'll talk about the opposites quite a bit in a lot of different manners, but with setup and execution, it's the opposite with hands and feet. So now, feet are on the outside of your hands are on the inside of your feet. Same idea, you break the floor with the barbell, stand tall, full extension, that's a complete sumo deadlift. There's a lot of variations to both. So variations of conventional, this is all lifter dependent, it's also depending on what your goals are, maybe the sport that you compete in. For example, strongmen, their feet are inside their hands. But these are very large individuals, so oftentimes you'll see their feet end up quite wider than like a typical power lifter. So they might be at shoulder width, if not wider, and their hands are even wider yet. They're still feet inside their hands. It is still a conventional pull, but they have much more width to their stance than what you would see in powerlifting. There's nothing wrong with it. Just depends on leverages, your body, and again, what your goals are. Sumo. Same thing, you're gonna see a lot of variation. You have some people that are very wide with their feet, almost to the plates, as wide as they possibly can, trying to get as many angles in their favor as possible for leverage, and then their hands will be inside, shoot their hips in, they got a complete sumo deadlift. Then you have some where they bring their feet just outside of their hands, almost like a frog stance or a modified sumo. So they'll bring their feet in just outside of their hands. It's still sumo, hands inside, feet outside, but that's where they feel the most comfortable. So what is best for you? I guess the lazy answer as a coach is what feels the best. And initially, that's not the wrong answer. So when you're starting out and you're getting started in your fitness journey, or say powerlifting, try them, and whichever one feels the most comfortable, grow with that form. Tweak it as you go. I will say there are some fundamental differences jumping into either style that you should consider. This doesn't necessarily have to be prior injury, but maybe a body predisposition to what your body has capabilities of and what it doesn't. And it could be mobility. So hips, right? Some of you field sport athletes, my jumpers out there, might be really tight laterally in the hips. You have a hard time getting your legs out there. Well, if you have a hard time spreading your legs into a sumo stance initially, it'd be kind of hard. It'd be a hard sell to say that you'd be comfortable deadlifting from that position. So maybe that's something you got to work on as far as mobility of the hips. And adversely, just because you have lateral flexibility in the hips doesn't necessarily mean you have the tensioning required to drive a barbell off the floor in a sumo position. But something to consider would be your hips. Another thing to consider is ankle mobility. A lot of people don't realize this, but when you're pulling conventional, you have more knee flexion, which means your knees are out over your feet more as you set up under the barbell. If you have really, really tight ankles, previous injuries, or just stiffness or a lack of attention, you might have a hard time getting into position. Sometimes you see really big guys that don't have the most flexible ankles struggle in the bottom position of a conventional stance because of the knee flexion. It puts them at a disadvantage. Sumo, rather, with your feet out wide, you tend to see much more vertical shins. It's a little bit easier on the ankles. Last body part I'm going to bring up, something to consider, is your knees. Conventional, this is just from my own personal experience, I can stack my weight and the bar weight over and through my knees because they're underneath me, and it's much more comfortable for knees that have some issues or some weaknesses. Whereas if you do have some issues with your knees, or I guess obstacles, sumo might be a challenge. Not because they're not underneath me anymore necessarily, but the stability is going to be provided to my body in that midpoint from my knees. They're now on islands And those islands on either side of me have to be anchored through the floor and through my feet. That anchor point and stress point, just kind of like a drawbridge, is coming through those knees. So for myself, I have some instability, I guess, internal, on the inside of my knees. There's some pain there. So if I'm that drawbridge driving my knees out in a sumo position, over time, that wear and tear starts to kick my butt. So it's a disadvantage. That just may not be the pull for me, and I've experienced with both. So hips, ankles, knees, so those are the big ones. And if you guys have noticed, I have not mentioned what is the first Google search on switching stance to stance: lower backs. And there's a reason why. There is this misconception, I guess broad misconception, that if you have a sensitive lower back or you have prior lower back injuries, you should not pull conventional, but you should switch to sumo because it's easier on your lower back. I couldn't disagree more. Yes, if you have a hard time pulling conventional without your lower back aggravating, my answer to you would be, let's include some corrective movements, exercise, blood flow, stretching, and rehab so that you can deadlift regardless of stance without back pain. That would be my number one priority, not necessarily just escaping the pull and switching the style. And two, depending on your leverages, my short torso, long-legged people, you're gonna jump into a sumo position, think that you're good to go because Google said and YouTube said that you can switch without back pain, and you're gonna aggravate that lower back because we didn't address the issue. We just tried to mask it by switching stances. Is there a way that you can stabilize your spine in a neutral-ish position and deadlift from either stance? Yes. That's not to say you can't protect yourself in certain ways with certain leverages by including certain cues. But that gets really nitty-gritty. And I'm talking about people that are sumo stance, very sensitive lower backs. I'm talking 10 out of 10 sensitivity. And they have to start from a static position, damn near upright with their torso, and they just drive through with their legs. But that's an extreme situation. That's an outlier situation. And that'd be really hard to replicate that in a conventional because your hips have to start behind the barbell. In sumo, they can line up almost right on top of it. That's really the only time where I would say, yep, you know what, this is a smart switch. Let's work with this. Static, start, upright chest, and we just vertically climb with the barbell to protect your back. Unless you're that person, outside of that, stop it. Let's fix your back. Let's fix what is leading into some of those ickies, those injuries, and those owies, and let's move. And let's find a way to trust your back through a wide variety of positions. Because more often than not, and then I'll drop the subject, people that want to switch from conventional to sumo because of their bad back have squatted low bar just fine. And when it comes to like angles, and it comes to compromising a spine as far as your bracing goes, you're gonna lose the argument there with me as far as long-term results and an easy fix. So I'll drop the subject there. Now, let's talk about leverages. The next thing that's brought up quite a bit between the two, and kind of a big internet argument, is if you have short torso, long legs, you need to pull conventional. If you're boxy, long torso, short legs, built like me, you should sumo. Not necessarily true either. Now, depending on your leverages, you've probably developed and underdeveloped certain muscle structures that are probably more inclined to dictate the movement for you rather than just having long legs. So I would just follow with what your body is telling you, see what feels good, and then drive through. Regardless of stance, there are some cues that I think are vital to keeping you healthy overall as you train and add weight to the barbell. And I want to talk about those things because conventional and sumo do have some similarities in kind of what we're trying to achieve in moving weight. But then there's also some really, really opposite differences in kind of mentally how you approach and engage the barbell. So we'll talk about that next. Okay, conventional deadlift. Again, this is where your feet are inside of your hands. Hands align outside. Now, beginner's tip, if we're starting from square one, deadlifting 101, let me just turn the bar back a little bit. I want you to incorporate a couple different styles in your training to see what feels the best. When I mean style, I'm talking about how you initiate the pull. Those are really the biggest differences. Basically, once the bar gets to your knees, we all look the same. We're dying until we get to lockout. But the beginning part, that's where we see a lot of differences from lifter to lifter. And I want you to experiment. I want you to figure out what works best for you, because we're all built a little bit different, have different injuries, have different backgrounds, and we initiate movement differently. So try them. First one, and this is gonna be either conventional or sumo, we'll adapt to both, but the first one is a static start. All that means is I'm gonna find myself in my position to the bar. I'm gonna align myself, better word. I'm gonna grab the bar, engage the bar slightly, and I'm gonna bring my hips into the starting position, and I'm gonna stay there while I start the pull. So I'll demonstrate. Static just means stationary, right? So I'm gonna find my position, get my grip, I'm gonna get myself into the start, and I'll start the deadlift here. That would be a static start. Those of you who are really, 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 really good at wedging, prying the bar off the floor, getting your midline inside that barbell to drive with force, are gonna find static to be a very good starting position. The other, dynamic. All that means, instead of a stationary start, we're moving into the start. Try it. For some of you that have a tendency to kind of fire their hips back, you kind of lose your knees off the start, sometimes just a quick switch of a dynamic start helps. So the only difference is, same positioning, but instead of staying in that position, I'm gonna let my hamstrings go just slightly, and then I'm gonna reload, and with that movement, drive my wedge and come on up. Slight difference. That's easier for me. That's generally how I start to deadlift. But those are the difference. Static, dynamic. Doesn't have to look like mine, but those are the starts that I'd want you to try to incorporate. All right, let's talk about issues with conventional. Most common. And it's called different things. It looks like different things. It has different symptoms, let's put it that way, but it's really the same issue. I'm talking about the bar escaping forward, knees that escape backwards, that float towards the top, that strain in the lower back, or the most visual is hips that shoot up too early. All of those are symptoms of not using your quads. So when I first came into powerlifting, they told me, do not squat your deadlift. And I understand what they're saying. You don't want to squat the deadlift, you want to deadlift the deadlift. But the idea of it being a pull or a yank, I think that's where people mess up, is we emphasize pulling the bar, which naturally kind of pulls us into this position instead of pushing with our legs. So the idea of not squatting the deadlift, I get it, but I do disagree slightly. I do want you to wedge and use your legs to drive the floor down. Separate yourself or the floor from the barbell by driving your feet through the floor. Use your quads. The more quad engagement you have, the more likely you're gonna maintain that knee flexion forward. You're gonna keep your back in a proper position. The barbell's gonna stay nice and close to you, which is what we want, and you'll have a good deadlift. So, what I'm talking about is rooting through the floor, using my legs to drive the floor down. Emphasize those cues. Use these legs, these muscles, to deadlift, not just pull the bar up and over. Grab the bar, wedge in, dynamic or static, drive the floor through the ground. Drive your feet through the floor. How's that? Okay, so from here, my emphasis is quads down. Pushing the floor away. What I don't want to do is pull and do, oh, that hurts even just doing it. Okay. Don't do that. Cue the legs, whatever verbiage works for you. Rooting, leg drive, hips through, not hips through, quads, okay? Heels, Some of those things work for some of the athletes, but we just need this to stay here. So knees stay forward, so butt stays down, chest comes up, good to go. That's conventional. All right, let's talk about sumo deadlifts. Sumo, legs wide, hands on the inside. I want to demonstrate the two different starting positions, and I want to explain why it's very important with sumo. So I didn't talk about it in the beginning, but conventional, in theory, it's not for everybody, but in theory, for most, it's really easy off the floor because you have your legs under you and you can use your legs as you deadlift, but it's harder at lockout because you don't have as much lateral stability and it relies on your posterior chain quite a bit. Sumo, opposite. It's difficult off the floor, requires a lot of patience, but it's much easier to lock out because your posterior chain is stabilized, you have lateral stability, and there's more anchors to you as you drive up past your knees. So you have static start, dynamic start. I would really, really, really do your homework and try both quite a bit. I'm talking about weeks, blocks, put some cycles together of training, figuring this out, because the make it or break it off of sumo is that start, is that initial beginning of the deadlift. Anybody that deadlifts sumo with an exorbitant amount of weight knows it's that start. How you start is how you finish. So if you can really, really hone in on what feels best for you, it's worth the homework. Okay, so let me show you a static start. Static would be hips are in position for a sumo, and I'm basically gonna allow my hips to come into the position that I want to start my pull from. So let's say here, I'll gather the bar, deadlift from that position, okay? That'll be static. Very similar to conventional, from a fixed position. Dynamic, just like conventional, we're gonna have a little bit of a swing, a little bit of a relax. We're gonna drive, and I'm gonna wedge, pulling my hips towards the crowd as I initiate the pull. So it might look like that, right? Play with either one. It's based on comfort, which one drives the best. So let's talk about the basics and the miscues with sumo. So here is where we fall into some mistakes. One, people underestimate how hard it is off the floor. I see it time and time and time again. Conventional pullers switching to sumo, frustrated, because with conventional, they could pull anything off the floor. Then they go to sumo with 70% of what they think they should do, and it's just not budging. It will, if you're patient and you understand going in, the bitch part of the movement is the beginning, that first inch. So if you can maintain mentally and know you're gonna be in for a grind and stay patient, eventually you're gonna ease into the lift. It's gonna get easier as you go. It's just hard to rewire your brain to thinking when I grab the barbell, it moves easy and it gets harder later. The hard part's right away. So that's usually one issue. Second is learning how to wedge. You can learn how to wedge with conventional. You have to learn how to wedge sumo. Wedging, all that means is getting my hips, getting my pelvis as close to that barbell and underneath my sternum from the beginning, the best that I can. That's my leverage point. If I can get my hips underneath and inside and drive up through, guiding my chest up, that's where the power is going to come from. What you don't want to do is create habits of being a conventional puller or style, going to sumo and pulling with high hips. So you're basically taking a wide stance. You want the advantages that this provides, but you're losing all of those advantages by pulling like it's conventional. You don't want to do that. At no point in time do you want your hips even parallel to your shoulders. You want your shoulders above your hips the entire time. So wedging, good slack pull, bending that bar. I always say hips towards the crowd. So as I initiate the pull, I'm driving my hips into the barbell through the crowd. Another thing that I like to do is guide my face up the wall so I end up at full lockout looking above everybody else. But where my head goes is really important with sumo. An added tip, I just posted a story recently with Trevor. Trevor's an amazing coach, worked with him for a long time. One thing he taught me was chin tuck, okay? That's huge with sumo. So he demonstrates it better than I do in his video, but as he begins the deadlift, or as he initiates the pull, one of his cues, and it works with a lot of his athletes, including myself, if we're trying to drive my sternum up and I'm trying to finish that wedge and come through with the deadlift, something as simple as driving this back naturally dictates my torso into proper position. So chin tuck on the way up, it helps maintain that sumo as well. All right, in closing, we talked about the basics. What is conventional? What is sumo? What does it look like? What muscles are being incorporated? How we want to engage them. Trial and error with dynamic starts or static starts and dynamic starts. Working on wedging, working on patience with sumo. All of those things we've talked about. Now let's talk about the training aspect of deadlifting and why it's hard. One, it's heavy because it's heavy. Bottom line. It's the heaviest of your lift more often than not. You do got your outliers that end up squatting more than they deadlift. But for the other 95% of us out there, deadlifting is the heaviest barbell that we touch. That has mental weight to it, right? It's heavy because it is. And that's something you have to accept going into deadlift workouts. You're moving something that's the heaviest that you get to move. We got to accept it. We got to find a way to embrace the fact that it's heavy, and that's a good thing. Number two, powerlifters. Our day on meet day is kind of make it or break it off of our deadlift. So it carries a lot of weight as far as anxiety goes, as far as mental weight, emotional weight. And in our competition, we know if we can't deadlift, then all of our efforts leading up to the deadlifts mean nothing. It all goes away. It's the final push, right? So that in itself carries a lot of emotional weight, and we end up inadvertently tying that to our training. Stop it. Approach deadlift just like anything else. Learn to embrace the suck. Yeah, it's heavy. That's a good thing. Look how strong you are. It's amazing. And two, instead of like thinking the mental anguish of, man, all of this pressure relies on deadlift. Yeah, it does. And that's a beautiful thing. Like that's something you should be fired up for. So instead of taking it as like a heavy challenge or that it's something that's an obstacle that's getting in the way of you and your big day as a powerlifter, instead, treat it as like squats are awesome, those are done, you're strong. Bench is awesome, it's America's lift, everybody asks how much you bench, beautiful, you got that done. Deadlift shouldn't be a mental anguish, it should be you showing off. It's showing off how strong you are. We all know it's the heaviest weight, so go show off. Let the ego set aside, let the mental anguish set aside, and just have some fun. I will say, despite the cues that we discussed, squat and bench, in theory, have a lot more cues and a lot more mental things to think about to execute the lift. Deadlifting, regardless of style, outside of like wedging, bracing, rooting, some of the basics that become very second nature, you just got to pick up the weight. Really, at the end of the day, you got to pick up the weight. And for safety consideration, if that's a fear, you just get to drop the weight. So if things don't go right, or worst case scenario, something does snag, something does hurt, you just let it go. It's no big deal. But the mental weight that we carry, I think that's why we carry it into our training, and I think that's why we fall behind and we plateau. Powerlifters, we end up becoming very fear-based around something that seems scary, seems heavy, and it all rides on it. Let that go, and let that go. Have some fun, rip it off the floor, wedge beautifully, lock it out with straight legs, and we're good to go. I hope this video helps. I will do another one soon on another lift, but there's been a lot of questions on deadlift, so I want to tackle that first. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and I'll see you guys soon.